Good morning. Thanks for joining us. My name is Chris Williams, and I serve as the chair of the Mormon Center for Space Studies, which is the independent think tank within the National Security Space Association. Today, we are thrilled to have with us Colonel Robert Davis, Program Executive Officer for Space Sensing within Space Systems Command, U.S. Space Force. Colonel Davis, welcome very much. Colonel Davis assumed command as PEO for Space Sensing on June the 8th of 2023. He has a deep and rich background that includes over 20 years of military experience, including tours in mission areas such as space control and overhead intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, and including satellite acquisition, launch, operations, and associated staff work for both the U.S. Air Force and the National Reconnaissance Office. He previously served as Senior Materiel Leader for the Space Systems Acquisition Delta within SSC's Military Satellite Communications and Precision Navigation and Timing Organization. One cannot overstate the importance of the roughly $25 billion in programs that Colonel Davis oversees. They are inextricably tied to our nation's security, indeed our very survival. For example, the Space Sensing Shop manages acquisition of sophisticated systems that provide integrated tactical warning and attack assessment of missile strikes against the United States, regardless of their source. That mission is getting more difficult as adversaries develop and field increasingly sophisticated missiles. Assuring effective tactical warning and attack assessment is vitally important, especially as Russia completes its nuclear modernization effort. China continues to rapidly expand its strategic forces, and North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un has ordered a major acceleration of production of ICBMs and nuclear warheads. Colonel Davis, to you and your team, thank you very much for your important work, your contributions to national security. Colonel Davis will have some opening remarks, then we'll turn to questions and answers. For members of our audience, if you have a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and add it there. I'll do my best to get through as many of your questions as possible in the 60 minutes that we have allocated for today's interview. Without further ado, Colonel Davis, thanks again for being with us today, and thank you for your service to our great nation. Sir, the floor is yours.
Hey, Chris, thank you for that kind introduction, and thanks for everybody joining today, and a special thanks to NSSA for hosting, allowing me to brag on the team a bit. You mentioned that, the team sport of this world we live in, both the government and industry team, and we'll touch on that throughout the conversation today. I definitely want to make this a conversation as best as this medium allows. I do have some open remarks, but I do want to get to those questions and that engagement. That's ultimately what this is all about, is the opportunity to engage with industry, share our message, of course, about some things we're thinking about, but also hear what you're thinking about as well. So I'm super excited about that. So before we do that, we'll just step through a couple of things to kind of set the stage and make sure you all appreciate just what's going on in my head, what's going on in space sensing and the SSC and the broader Space Force. So the first thing we need to do is really make sure we have some context, though. You guys all know this, but it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway and foot stomp as many times throughout this conversation, is that we're in a race. Chris mentioned some of those things in his opening remarks, how it's incredibly important the strategic missile warning and other missile warning and tracking capabilities are for our nation. And it's only highlighted every day. We see it in the news, we see it in intel reports for those that have access to that, just how important this mission area is. Traditionally, we've had this mission area going on for decades, always doing that overwatch, that always watching eye, protecting our nation, particularly that deterrence factor. And it's increasingly important as nations proliferate technology and technology grows to make it harder to not only see the launches, but then track those hyperglide vehicles and other maneuvering capabilities that put our forces and our nation, frankly, in harm's way. It's not only the targets that have gotten harder, it's also the counterspace threats that you all also hear about every day. China and Russia have seen how we take advantage of the space domain and have looked for ways to deny our capabilities in that regime. And we've all heard that space is warfighting domain. That's very true. It's a hyper focus for myself when I come to work every day. And the entire team is, how do we get after the threat in the race we're in? How do we get after tracking the targets that are ever more advanced and doing so in a way that counters the counterspace threat? The SecAF, Secretary Kendall has made it very clear that we're in a very different world than we've lived in a long time as a nation. And our return to great power competition and charging us with making sure that we're doing everything we can every single day in response to that changing world. And there's a little graph there that's representative on the right side. You can see just how much is changed in this area, this mission area. You can kind of see a steady state number of missile launches that have happened over time. And since the Russian-Ukraine invasion and the aggression there, and then more recently with other activities in the Middle East, there's been a tremendous increase in the number of events we're seeing every year with the capabilities that those before me have developed, and many of you contributed to for our nation's defense. Just imagine what that curve would look like in a more of a near-peer competition, and just all the capabilities that we need to make sure are ready to go if that day ever comes. Next slide, please. So how are we going to win that race? Well, there's a number of guiding principles that our leaders have asked us to think about. The first, of course, is the SecAF's order of battle, of operational imperative number one. It's number one for a reason. He's made that very clear. We have to get that order of battle right. And part of that is making sure we're pivoting to resilient architectures. That's a core theme throughout the entire thinking of our shift in missile warning architectures and missile tracking architectures. Many of you probably heard the SecAF a couple of space symposiums ago when he often talks about his top three priorities, which is a reminder, just in case you don't know, are China, China, China. And maybe he was playing to the crowd a bit, but a couple of space symposiums ago, when he was a keynote, he said his answer to China, China, China was space, space, space. And so that obviously puts a lot of focus on the work that we're doing at SSC and the Space Force writ large to be responsive to that leadership guidance. From there, we have the Chief of Space Operations, General Saltzman's theory of competitive endurance, right, for our theory of success. And making sure that we avoid operational surprise, deny first mover advantage, and conduct responsible counterspace campaigning. And that deny first mover advantage really ties that pivot to resilient architectures when it comes to our mission area and the direction we're headed with the fielding of new capabilities in NEO and LEO, which we'll talk about a little bit. Making sure that we deny that benefit of possible action by a competitor, and give them pause before they decide to move from the competitive phase into the crisis or conflict phase. So how are we going to do those two things? How are we going to make sure we have the right space order battle with resilient architectures? How are we going to make sure we deny that first mover advantage? That's when we make that transition into the acquisition lane. And we obviously have all heard Honorable Cavelli's framework for acquisition success, his tenets and his formula for going fast, between lower NRE, smaller satellites, fixed price contracts, and getting after the threat to make sure we can go as fast as possible to deliver capability. And then many of you have also heard SSC's mantra of exploit what we have, buy what we can, and build only what we must. And so that entire theme is happening throughout the mission area to make sure we're getting after that threat in the race that we're in. And the most important aspect of this is how are we going to do this as partner to win? And we've said, partner to win for a long time, but what I've seen is a renewed interest in that partnership, not only with traditional partners, with industry, within industry, but new partners in industry as well. And we have to take the partnership we have with industry to the next level. And we've all talked about that for years, but in order for us to really keep pace and have a chance to keep pace with the adversary and the competitors, we have to win this race by partnering and working together as closely as we can. And now that takes two sides. The government has to make sure that we're very clear and transparent with our requirements and whatnot, because you guys in the industry have to be able to respond to those. But we also need that conversation to happen where industry helps us make sure we're asking the right questions. Government obviously has a lot of interest and a lot of expertise, and with our FRDCs and others to make sure we craft requirements in a certain way and whatnot. But you all understand the technology that's out there available the best, what your companies and your partners can best offer. And so helping us craft that and making sure we get those requirements right, that foundation right, is vitally important. And then part of that too is when we start talking about contract types and making sure that we're being mindful of industry's need to have a fair chance of reasonable profit, and then the industry's responsibility to make sure they're coming back to the government and bidding at price points and cost points that are reasonable and achievable. Because what we can't do, as many of you have heard the SE talk about, is keep locked into a certain approach and putting more money after bad we have to make sure those dollars and cents make sense up front, and that we're all executing, super focused on execution and delivering capability to the warfighter. That's all going to require that super tight partnership between industry and government, making sure we're getting after that threat. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about what's inside the space sensing portfolio, and we'll dive deep in a couple of those areas. So we're hyper-focused every day on delivering integrated and resilient space sensing capabilities that sense make sense to win. The 800-member strong team spread across several areas across the United States, and with about a $5 billion a year portfolio. We have three main mission areas. We have the missile warning, track, and defense, which has been kind of the focus of the conversation so far, and most people associate with our work. There's also the space-based environmental monitoring, and an exciting new area called tactical surveillance, reconnaissance, and tracking. So I'll touch on each of these briefly here, and then we'll dive deeper and then get to your questions and answers. So missile warning, tracking, defense, a number of activities going on there, huge pivots going on in the architecture, in close collaboration with the Space Development Agency, SDA, and the Missile Defense Agency and MDA, in a combined program office that's making huge efforts to get after the threat and win the race every day. Huge wins happening all the way from the senior levels all the way down to the lowest, and that close collaboration, integrating the multiple programs that have to come together to close those kill chains and make sure we're protecting the homeland and troops and our allies and partners downrange. A key element of that is making sure not only do we get the space segment right, but also think greater about how we get after the ground, which becomes ever more important in this new proliferated architecture. In space-based environmental monitoring, there's been a number of capability areas that the nation has relied on us to fill for the warfighting support, very unique weather requirements for the DoD, forecasts and whatnot. And traditionally, that was supported by the Defense Meteorological Support Program, DMSP. And now that is more focused now on a disaggregated architecture between a weather system follow-on microwave and EOIR weather system, EWS, which is having great successes there. We'll talk about a little bit later. Huge opportunities to continue to collaborate with NOAA and other areas, other partners in that area to deliver those requirements. And then last, I mentioned this briefly as a new and exciting area, tactical surveillance, reconnaissance, and tracking, or TAC-SRT. Many of you heard that term in that context. Is an area we're getting into and piloting and experimenting with. Is how does the Space Force take advantage of emerging commercial data analytics, of commercially available information and publicly available information to provide support to the warfighter downrange. A lot of activity going on there right now, a lot of collaboration happening with NGA, the NRO, and others in the IC as we help make sure we get the right roles and responsibilities defined and make sure that we're doing everything we can to collectively, as both the DoD and IC partnership, provide the best capabilities we can to the warfighter. Won't be talking about that area too much today, just due to the newness of it, and there's a lot of activity going on, but I look forward to coming back to you in the future and sharing more about that exciting mission area. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the missile warning architecture. So what the picture here shows is pretty much the architecture we have today and have had for a number of years. A very geocentric based architecture with a HEO orbit to provide polar coverage. And that has worked and served our nation well for decades. And that's because the threats against the nation in those decades has been ballistic missiles that are very bright on their boost phase and follow very, very predictable trajectories after that fact, and with a minimal counterspace threat. And we had built-in resiliency features against those space threats at the time. Well, as you all know, both those things are changing. The missile threats are changing, and the type of technology, the proliferation, and the counterspace technology is changing as well. So we have to do something different. So the first thing we've done is, turning to the next slide, please. We looked at how do we enhance that current architecture. And so in 2018, we started on the next generation OPR program, which comprised of a geo element replenishment effort, a polar replenishment effort, and a refactoring of the ground to get a first start against that enhanced resiliency needed for the nation. A lot more sensitivity happening with those new designs, new technology that gets after some of that ability to track those dimmer maneuvering targets and starts to layer in resiliency against those threats. And it really starts our pivot to an important element of the architecture is a shift from a sensor-centric architecture to a data-centric architecture with a whole new ground system that's government-owned, modular in nature, cyber secure from the ground up to protect against that very, very challenging cyber threat that we all know is happening every day. But looking to the future, that's not enough. So we see the pivot to the MEO and LEO that you all are understanding is happening right now. Space Development Agency, I mentioned earlier, a very close partner of ours, developing the proliferated LEO constellation. And you've seen what the activities they've had there and their Tranche 0, the successes they've had. And they're looking to get after Tranche 1 here in the next end of this year with the transport layer, and in the spring with the first of the tracking layer. The MEO layer is right behind them. We have Epic 1 build happening right now. We're about ready to go out with our release of Epic 2's RFP. Many of you are involved in that conversation, and we're excited to continue to partner with industry to field that. We still have that resilient backstop, the survivable backstop, the geo layer, and the polar layer coverage as we transition through this, and continue to build out a robust architecture that's resilient against not only the targets that we have to track, but that growing space threat that we've all seen and our adversaries are building and demonstrating on a regular basis. And we're going to continue to partner with the SDA and MDA to build this out, integrate it, and provide the best capability we can together for the nation. We'll switch gears a little bit here to space-based environment monitoring. I mentioned this briefly earlier, some huge successes lately. We launched a EO/IR CubeSat demonstration to prove just how small we can get to deliver on those EO/IR cloud characterization and theater weather requirements that the JROC has asked us to get after. And we just launched the first weather system follow-on microwave, WSFM, a few months ago, and both have had great success, quickly getting to their checkouts and starting to produce data, get the calibrations right. And we're going to be getting data, especially on WSFM, to the warfighter here this fall. So we're very excited about that, completing those calibrations. Both of those systems will continue. WSFM will launch, and again, the second vehicle in 2 years. Next year, we have a different EO/IR system, an ops demo system that will launch, and that will also happen. Another launch of that will happen for Space Vehicle 2 years after that. But then we have a question, right? What comes after those two disaggregated systems that are replacing DMSP? We currently are doing a study, and we're really looking hard at what further can we exploit. There's a lot of exploit already happening in this area between civil and international. But what other things are out there that we might be able to exploit? But really what we're really focused on for this study is what can we buy? There's emerging weather capabilities out there in the commercial market. And so we're very interested in exploring those to see what kind of requirements can we solve for the nation, for the warfighter, at a different, with a different approach that provides resiliency, provides economies of scale and whatnot to be able to do so more efficiently. We completely recognize that it might not be a perfect fit based on what commercial is provided, but we have to make sure we're asking those tough questions about what can we do with the commercial and move forward and partner with commercial to tailor their offerings to meet our requirements. Many of you saw the commercial space strategy that came out I guess probably a couple months ago now with the Space Force, and space-based environment monitoring was definitely one of those areas that were highlighted as areas that we want to get after and really fully explore what commercial capabilities we can bring to bear to solve tough warfighting problems. And we're excited about that. If you're not involved with that conversation, please reach out. We've had one industry day already, and we're looking forward to continuing to hear more about what industry can provide in that regard. All right, I think that wraps things up. Just remind everybody why we're here. We're here to win that race, and how we're going to do that. We're going to do that together. We're going to continue the close partnerships and collaboration we have with industry to make sure we're hyper-focused on delivering capabilities to counter that threat. And with that, I look forward to the engagement we have here and hearing what's on your mind. Chris, back over to you.
Well, thank you very much. A great presentation, a lot of rich material there, so thank you for that. My first question is, you touched on the Combined Program Office for Missile Warning, Missile Tracking, and Missile Defense. How are the relationships among SSC, SDA, and MDA working out? And what do you see as some of the advantages and some of the challenges, frankly, of having a multi-agency effort in that regard?
Chris, it's been wonderful. You know, there's always that question mark. People hear combined program office, joint program office, and it raises some concerns given some historical examples of that. But I will tell you, primarily due to the reason how I started this conversation with that focus on the race, everybody's all in. We have very tight relationships with our counterparts at SDA and MDA, all the way up and down the chain. Just yesterday, I was shoulder to shoulder with Col Rasmussen, for those that know Raz at SDA, briefing the Defense Science Board, right? And either one of us could have given the brief. That's how integrated we are. We build our programs. We know how they're integrated on a acquisition timelines and requirements baselines. We know how they're integrated on a technical basis. It's a complete collaborative effort to make sure we're doing everything we can to deliver capability. So it's been absolutely wonderful.
That's great. The next gen OPIR program was initiated at the behest of then Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Hyten, with a goal of delivering the first next gen OPIR spacecraft on orbit by 2025. What's the status of the program? Do you think you'll meet the goal of launch by 2025? And what are the biggest challenges facing the program? And overall, how well do you think the program will deliver on the vision that General Hyten and others had for the program?
Yeah, the program's going great. Some of us have been in this business a long time. I won't say how long I've been. And Chris, I know from our earlier conversation, you don't want to talk about how long you've been in business either, but 2018 was 6 years ago. And to start a program of that magnitude 6 years ago, and today to still be on the original schedule still for a launch date, speaks volumes to the team, the current team, the team that came before them, as they came to work every day with that focus on getting up there by 2025. And there were specific reasons for those dates that many of us are aware of. So they're hyper-focused on that still. Now, every development program has their challenges. Many of you have heard about, from Honorable Cavell and others, that we're certainly having some challenges in the payload. We're in TVAC right now on the payload, looking to get that delivered in maybe a month or two, and get that into the single line flow integration at Lockheed Martin, and get to the launch pad by December 2025. So we're still on track for that, and super excited to get to the next phase of the build of the spacecraft.
Thank you. The Space Force is pivoting its missile warning programs to proliferated systems in LEO and MEO, as you mentioned. However, it's not clear that the P-LEO and MEO systems meet the full nuclear command, control, and communications requirements for nuclear hardening and survivability. Meanwhile, there are no plans on the books to continue the next-gen spacecraft, which do meet NC3 requirements after the Block 0 spacecraft plural are delivered. Is there a plan to meet the NC3 requirements after next gen? And will future P-LEO and MEO systems need to be upgraded to meet those hardening requirements? Or do you anticipate there'll be a separate system in the future dedicated to NC3? And the context obviously is with great power competition heating up and dramatically increasing nuclear threats and the like, the hardening requirements that go into some of those systems are very much on front of mind these days.
That's a great question, and we get that a lot. So I'll answer it in two ways. First, I'll talk about just the general approach that we're taking with both the LEO system at Space Development Agency and with MEO at SSC. It's very much, if you will, an agile hardware development, an agile program. Obviously, the turn times are a little different when you're building spacecraft than a software drop, but it's the same principle. Historically in space and DD acquisitions in general, we've always had this traditional process, in theory anyway. It doesn't always work out this way, but you get your requirements, and then you go through the process, get your budget and your action strategy, and everything has to say, how are you meeting those requirements in the day? Show me your schedule, your plan from today till when you deliver. And everything's very well understood understandably so, before we start spending the treasure that our nation has provided us to provide these capabilities. That has served us well, and certainly in space for years, but we can't continue to follow that exact model. We have to be able to be more reactive to the threat, more to emerging technology, and that's what you're seeing in this more agile hardware approach. And so the hyper-focus, and I say that, semi-pun intended at this point, I've said it so many times, the hyper-focus of both SDA and SSC is to provide a tracking capability the nation doesn't have today. Those before me and the teams have created a wonderful survivable and durable architecture that served our nation well, and that's going to be there for some time to come. We don't have is the tracking capability against these advanced threats. That we don't have is the proliferated architectures that'll help us make sure we can counter the space denying capabilities the competitors are building. So that's our hyper focus. Now we can't forget those other important requirements you mentioned. So we're currently working with the Space Warfighting Analysis Center, the SWAC, who's doing a survival and durable study to help us figure out what's the next generation of those capabilities, and how do we lay those in. And so with the agile approach of our development, we will look at the outcome of that study, and they may affect future epics or potentially future tranches of both SDA's work and our work to make sure we're meeting that full requirement set for the nation that these capabilities will want provided.
Thank you. And I'll remind our audience that we welcome your questions. Several have come in, and we'll get to those in just a moment. So if you have questions, please enter them in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. One of Assistant Secretary Calvelli's space acquisition tenets calls for delivery of the ground segment before the launch of the space segment. Looking across your portfolio, will space sensing be in compliance with this directive? And along these lines, give us a little more on the status of the FORGE program.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned this briefly earlier, and thanks for the opportunity to footstop it again. We are absolutely focusing more every day on the data and having a pivot between sensor-centric to data-centric architecture focus. What that really means is the elevation of the ground. I always hate doing these briefings and showing the charts I show, because it's so hard really to adequately represent how important the ground is. Just the scale of orbits and everything, the space segment consumes the chart, and then over in the corner, in the charts I showed earlier, we see FORGE, right, or the legacy ground for SBIRS Block 20. But I can't understate just how much that little real estate on the slide actually represents. And many of you have been around this mission area and know how true that is. It's only getting more true tomorrow. As we go from a couple of handfuls of sensors on orbits to over 100 between the PLEO and the PMEO constellations, that data-centric focus in the ground is going to be all the more important. How do we fuse that data? How do we make sure it gets to multiple customers and the latency needed to close kill chains against these threats at speeds that we haven't seen before? And so we're really focused on the ground and the FORGE system from the strategic missile warning perspective, but not exclusively. MDA has the BOA system, and other communities have other systems that we're all collaborating with and providing data to out of these space architectures. And we're really focused on FORGE though here with SSE. FORGE is a completely new way of doing business, modern software approaches, building on a framework that we're building out, and then having the apps right on top of that. And I'm really excited how the progress the team is going. We had our first operational delivery in the spring to the OPR Battle Space Awareness Center out in Buckley, for those familiar with that. So FORGE is in operations today, providing battle space awareness support to our warfighters. Another operational delivery happening probably a little after the new year, and how the timelines go. And then we're looking forward to continuing that thread throughout. And so the FORGE program is going very well. There's other elements other than that. There's recapitalization efforts happening on the ground antennas as well. It gets included there. And there's some other capabilities for C2 that are happening, supporting both legacy C2 and the future of C2 for next-gen GEO, next-gen polar, and eventually other systems beyond that.
I have a couple of questions from our colleague at the National Security Space Association, Mike Tierney. For those who know Mike, probably the best congressional budget analyst around on national security space matters. And Mike asks, Congress has generally been a strong proponent of SDA's and SSC's new LEO and MEO missile warning, missile track capabilities to rapidly deploy a new space architecture to characterize and track all hypersonic threats and improve attribution. The MEO initiative alone has grown to nearly $6 billion across the FYDP in the FY25 budget, while the original projection in the FY23 request was around $1 billion. So very significant growth in that. And the questions he has are, what's changed over the past couple of years that necessitates a greater investment in this mission area, these programs? And he also asks, Epic 2 is the next phase of the program beginning in FY25, but the House Appropriations Defense Subcommittee cut nearly $100 million from the program in their mark. Are you concerned that these cuts will impact your ability to deliver the program on budget and on schedule? It's a mouthful, sorry.
Let me see if I got all the pieces there, and ask me again the pieces. Maybe
Sure.
I don't remember. But the first off, right, going back to first order here, why is the budget's increased? Well, the threat has changed, and it requires us to invest in this area to counter that threat. Again, both the target threat, the hyperglide vehicles, and other maneuverable capabilities that our legacy systems just weren't designed for, and then the counterspace capabilities that our competitors are demonstrating and fielding every day. So that's thing one. Thing two, I completely appreciate how challenging it is every year, both within the department and the executive branch and the legislative branch, to make sure we are prioritizing, every dollar we spend on our nation's defense. And I often tell people, my wife was a school teacher once upon a time, and so I come to work every day, and when I'm thinking about numbers and dollars, I always have in the back of my mind, what would my wife's school have done with that, fill in the blank amount of money. And so we have to be very mindful and being good stewards of taxpayer dollars and the resources that thankfully the nation's said this is important for to get after this. As far as the current 24 budget, we'll see how that plays out. Again, I completely appreciate the challenge we all have of prioritizing resources. Part of the element, the greatness of the agile acquisition approach we have, it does allow some flexibility with the number of vendors, the number of planes we'll buy and whatnot. And we're going to use whatever resources that we're blessed to get after this threat and get as far as we can, as fast as we can, to provide that tracking capability and eventually more robust warning capabilities for vulnerable and all the other requirements on top of that as best we can. Did I hit all elements there?
I think you did. Thank you. Thank you. Additional question is, Congress has looked more intently at SDA-related activities. They pay a lot of attention to the Space Development Agency activities, and resilient missile warning, missile tracking as well. Has the shift in focus from sort of traditional Space Force programs to SDA helped or hurt, in your mind, next gen OPIR? Is the attention that is being paid to these programs benefiting the programs, or how would you characterize that? I guess the way Mike phrased the question is Congress taking their eye off the ball by focusing more on new initiatives as opposed to existing programs?
No, I don't see that at all. I can see how maybe that perception is out there in the press, because just the amount of discussion that we have about the new architecture, with PLEO and PMEO. But I'm regularly out here interfacing with Congress and the staffers. In fact, I'm doing that this afternoon, and I can assure you that they are looking at the entire portfolio and very focused on making sure that we have those replenishment programs on track with next gen GEO and next gen Polar, and Forge to support those, but also looking to the future for I'm sure SDA fields questions regularly on the PLEO side. I know I do on the MEO side, and how Forge is going to evolve to accommodate those space layers as well. So absolutely everybody in the whole of government has not taken their eye off the ball on the need to keep the current architecture going, replenish those, enhance that capability that we're today in the GEO and Polar regimes, and then continue to shift and pivot to the future as well.
Thank you. In some parts of the DoD space acquisition enterprise, there's an emphasis on firm fixed price contracts. What do you see as the strengths and weaknesses in FFP contracts, and to what extent are you seeking to leverage those types of contracts for systems that fall within the space sensing directorate?
Yeah, so there's a lot of conversations right now in industry, and the short answer is there's no 100% right answer. Every contract type has its pros and cons. Every acquisition strategy has different angles and pros and cons as well. And the key is to make sure that you understand the tools that are in your toolbox and apply the right tool to the right situation. And so I think you've seen that, right? A lot of the interest happens to be fixated on the firm fixed price, but you've seen the Space Force and acquisition leadership make sure that we're using the right tool in certain situations. For cost plus type based contracts for the right technical challenges, and I think you'll continue to see that. But what you're going to continue to see is still a emphasis on considering fixed price based contracts. And what I often talk to people industry about when they come and ask questions about that and are thinking of that is, it goes back to what I said in my opening remarks about partnership. The partnership between the DoD and industry needs to be closer than ever. It needs to be a two-way conversation. And that comes when we're talking about the contract type as well. If we are asking you to develop technology that you think is too much risk for a fixed price contract on our MEO Epic 2, for example, but other programs in the future may be this way as well, then we need that feedback. We may need to adjust our requirement set, our expectations, to make sure it's in a place the industry feels comfortable having a fair chance at a reasonable profit to be competitive in that space. Or we may need to change our contract type, right? And so we need to have that just really roll up our sleeves dialogue to make sure we're getting that right. Because we can't have a DIB that isn't successful, right? The nation absolutely needs that defense industrial base to be able to win this race, and we need to partner to make sure we get that right. It's a tough challenge, right? I know from the conversations I've had with many of you, but I know it's something we can get after if we just roll up our sleeves, shoulder to shoulder, look at the requirement set, challenge the requirement set, make sure we get that right, and then make sure we get the contract structure right as well to support that requirement set.
Thank you. We have several questions from the audience. I'll touch on the first one. How does the DoD Space Sensing PEO split the space-based environmental monitoring mission with civil agencies like NOAA? How's the relationship going with them, and what are the roles and responsibilities there?
The relation is great. Colonel Dan Muskowski is the senior material leader for that area. It's engaged regularly with the community. The relationship is so great that we have twice now taken old GOES satellites from NOAA, transfer them to Space Force, and employ them to fill warfighting capabilities. And so we have a close collaboration there, regularly engaging with them. There's a huge, I mentioned this earlier, but there's a huge dependency on the civil data and international data throughout the entire weather community to meet civil requirements, international requirements, and then from our perspective, right, making sure we're meeting those warfighting requirements as well.
We have another question from the audience. Let's see. Colonel Davis, you mentioned one of the changes coming forward is a government-owned resilient ground architecture. Can you highlight your plans for which programs you're going to are your focus areas to support your pivot to a data-centric ground enterprise?
So Forge will be that foundation for all of that. All of the systems we're fielding are going to utilize Forge going forward in different capacities. First off, that framework, that common hardware baseline, and the cyber baseline that enables us to make sure we have that cyber resiliency we need for developers to build on top of their apps. If it's a C2 app, for a MEO spacecraft, if it's a C2 app or a next-gen polar spacecraft, that framework's that foundation. The other piece of the Forge is it will do the 3D fusion for the Cheek Missile Warning Mission and other partners of all the sensors we're developing. Now, there's multiple paths that the data will go to for fusion, but Forge is a key element of that architecture, taking in the traditional capabilities that will remain on orbit for some time with SBIRS, next-gen GEO coming on the replenishment, next-gen polar, but LEO and MEO as well. Data will come from those programs, get fused in Forge, and be produced and reported out to the Street Missile Warning community and theater community and other users.
It raises a broader question about cybersecurity requirements that you touched upon. How would you characterize those requirements? Are they very, very stringent? Are they likely to stay apace with the cyber threats that are growing tremendously? And obviously, space systems are a prime threat, or a prime target for foreign actors, especially on the cyber front. How would you characterize overall the stringency of the cybersecurity requirements and the costs that are associated with those? How do you trade those off?
It's always a challenge, right? Making sure you have the right requirement, especially in cyber where it changes every day. That's why it's important to make sure you get the fundamental architecture right, which we have with Forge. Provide that more modular approach, that framework that underlies it, so you can continue to update and modernize that framework and the cybersecurity that underpins that without having to go back and break open all the apps and actual functionality that rides on top of that every single time you want to get in there. We've all seen that in the past where you make a change in a very closed, intertwined system. You make a change over here and it ripples through unexpectedly sometimes. We all experienced that recently with, or not, some more than others with the cybersecurity patch that went awry. So we got to be very mindful of making sure we have the right foundation that allows for those changes, allows the containerized capabilities that actually deliver the mission on top of that to be unaffected by those underlying changes.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about foreign counterspace threats. Obviously, the threat is real and growing. Which are the types of threats that worry you the most? We just talked about cyber a little bit, but what other threats are you worried about the most? And how has the public discussion about a potential Russian nuclear ASAT affected how you think about nuclear hardening requirements and other aspects?
Well, just like my children, there's no one threat that I focus on more than the other. We have to focus on them all because they're all very real. And many of you, like I said earlier, have seen that with the intelligence reports. Many of you, even without access to intelligence reports, can see it. Our competitors have been very bold in demonstrations and shown us what they're capable of and shown us their intent. And so we have to respond. We're eagerly waiting the development as we collaborate with SWAC of the future architecture for cyber neural force design. And it'll absolutely have to take into account, all the threats we know about today and all threats that intelligence projects for the future. But we have to keep after it. We have to keep approaching it with the agile approach that we have. Every 2 years between Space Development Agency and SSC, there's a RFP on the street and a launch. And we keep that agile approach going so we can always keep pace, respond to threats that come along, and making sure we're never stagnant in our response.
Another question from the audience. The Space Force recently canceled its contract with RTX for MEO missile warning, reducing the number of suppliers for Epic 1 to just 2, Millennium and L3 Harris. Is the Space Force planning to buy more satellites from one or the other contractor or increase contract options there to make up for RTX's exit? And then more broadly, the question asks, what are the implications of this on the state of competition in the program going forward?
Yeah, I'll work that backwards. The competition is great. We have a lot of interest in Epic 2, and we're looking forward to receiving those offers after we do the RFP drop here later this month or early next month. And I think the SDA would say the same. There's no shortage of competition in the market, which is awesome. That's a testament to industry and everything you guys are doing to try to contribute to the nation's defense. And I think it's also a testament to the government's approach to engage with industry and make sure we're writing requirements and developing programs in a way, and act strategies in a way that supports that vibrant market. I will say that you've heard Honorable Cavelli talk about it. Some of you've heard me talk about it. Other POs talk about it. But the importance of holding industry accountable. We have to absolutely make sure we're partnering up front to get the contract type right, making sure we get the action baseline right, tech baseline right, and the cost profiles right. And then we have to execute those programs. The government has to do its part to execute that program, make sure there's not creep and other things that sometimes have driven challenges into program schedules or costs. The industry has to do the same. And when there's a challenge there, we have to make sure that we're being very bright-eyed about what the options are and making tough choices sometimes about moving forward. And that's what we did in the case of Epic 1. And so we are pivoting there, and we're currently evaluating different options to consider to how to utilize those resources we had previously planned to spend on the development of the one vendor. And certainly we're looking at how do we make sure that we continue the pace of the program and get that initial warfighting capability, which is that missile tracking capability the nation doesn't have today. How do we get that out there as quickly as possible?
Another audience question is, as Space Futures Command stands up soon, what is the likely impact, if any, to SSC and more specifically Space Sensing Systems and Capabilities Acquisition? What will be the relationship between the two organizations?
I'm very excited about that Futures Command, having the opportunity to coalesce the future thinking from frankly some disparate pockets of the Space Force today in a single organization that's completely focused on that 40-year look down to like the 10-year look or so across that command's 3 centers. We're going to continue to have a very tight partnership with those elements. In some cases, some of those are currently in SSC or SWAC or whatever. We have a very tight relationship with SWAC. I regularly talk to my counterpart there, like my team does, and we're going to continue that in the Futures Command as well, and become ever more important as Future Command continues to develop out how their processes are going to be, how the force design process is going to mature, and how they're going to support that. But it's absolutely critical from a 40-year concept all the way through operations of a capability today. The Space Force needs to have that horizontal integration and thinking throughout to make sure we're responding to the threat. We're not that big, the Space Force. Sometimes that's a curse, but in this case, it's a blessing. And we can be nimble enough and be flat enough to have those conversations across the 3 different field comms responsible for thinking about the future, developing the future, then operating and fielding, operating, and providing readiness generation and presentation to the Joint Force. So I'm excited about the Futures Command, and I think the relationships we have with the entities that will become Futures Command will remain strong and probably get stronger.
That's great. Question from the audience: where do our partners and Five Eye and NATO allies fit into the overall architecture that you're developing, including interactions with MDA, SDA, NOAA, commercial partners, and the combatant commands? Where do the allies fit in some of these opportunities?
Well, on the weather side, you mentioned NOAA. I think there's a question there on the weather. I mentioned earlier a lot of international capabilities. There's essentially an international consortium right now, kind of coalition of the willing, that people provide capabilities to and then provide data to others out of. On the missile warning side, some early thinking going on there. We have a history of partnering with hosting capabilities in different partner nations, but what's the next steps? So we're working with through the International Affairs Shop, the NRIs, for those that know her, and having conversations with some of our allies and partners to see what possibilities are there. And there's interest there. They all see the threat too. They all see the emerging missile technology and the counterspace threat. And they're very interested. How do they make sure that this data is available to them, possibly through partnering with the United States to make sure they can protect their homelands, protect their troops downrange, and their allies and partners as well. Thank you.
Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space Acquisition and Integration, Frank Calvelli, recently penned a memo that elevated the Space Force Space Systems Integration Office, led by Ms. Leone, to include programs in the SDA and the Space RCO, for example. And she'll also serve as the new Chief Space Systems Engineer and advise Mr. Calvelli on integration across all Space Force PEO portfolios and applicable mission partner organizations. That's a mouthful, but quote from the memo. How will you and your organization interface with Ms. Leone in these new capacities?
Honestly, it's going to be no change for us how we interact with Dr. Leon. SSIO is, since Space Systems Command stood up 3 years ago, has been a key organization integrating across the PEOs and the mission areas, and that's going to continue and only expand. I'm really excited for where Honor Cabelli is taking this integration effort. We had tight relationships, and Dr. Leon had close relationships with those external SCC before. This formalizes those relationships and allows us to make sure we're really integrating not just SSC, but also with the other acquisition entities inside the Space Force under Honorable Cabelli's portfolio.
Well, you've had a remarkable career in many respects, and that includes obviously a significant amount of experience at the National Reconnaissance Office. Can you talk about how closely aligned the NRO and the Space Systems Command are, and what lessons did you derive from earlier in your career, and how the NRO operates versus how Space Systems Command operates, and are there important lessons that can be derived from that and applied in either direction?
Absolutely. It obviously varies based on the need for the relationship, the mission area. So we have conversations regularly with folks at the National Reconnaissance Office about how there might be synergy in some of the mission areas we have. As far as experiences on both sides, both in National Reconnaissance Office kind of acquisitions and operations, and Space Force acquisition operations, there's obviously things that both sides can learn from each other. NRO has certain characteristics that makes them successful, and then the Space Force and Air Force before them at Space Systems Command and Space Missile Center has had other characteristics made them successful, right? It's definitely an opportunity to continue to get better every day as we improve our processes and capabilities in delivering to the warfighter. I think some of the things that I really valued from my NRO experience, and I've seen applied more so every day in the Space Force, is that the ability to really push down responsibility, authority, and accountability to the lowest level possible. It really empower folks, as Chief Saltzman talks about all the time about mission command, right? How do you employ that in acquisition mindset as well? How do you empower your people at the lowest level to make decisions? That's been a long tenet in my experience anyway at the NRO, is pushing that down, and we're getting after that in the Space Force too. And it's amazing the speed some of these young officers and civilians, if you empower them and let them go and support them from behind, just what they're able to achieve. That's a huge element that I see the culture shifting, and I'm super excited to continue to see that.
That's great. We have another question from the audience that says, "Sir, the recent CrowdStrike global disruption of information points to vulnerabilities that may be exploited by our adversaries in future conflicts." We talked a little bit earlier about cyber vulnerabilities. And then the question is, what are you doing, and more broadly, what is DoD doing to avoid increasing reliance on missile warning systems that may seem affordable, but ultimately may not work when most needed? Highlighting what could be vulnerabilities from those systems that maybe don't have as significant cybersecurity features as others.
Well, I don't know any system that is hyper focused on cyber protection. So I don't think any of the systems are going to cut corners there, if you will, or have different levels of cybersecurity. I know Space Development Agency is really focused on that. I know SSC is really focused on that, so I'm not concerned there. If the question is more of a, hey, if everybody's dependent on one design or something, and if that design has a flaw that nobody knew about, does that put the nation at risk? I would suggest that's all the more reason that there's an advantageous approach going on between what Space Development Agency and SSC is doing. We have multiple vendors, multiple designs, multiple ground configurations that ultimately feed into the Forge and MDAs, processing and whatnot. And so there's a diversity in the capabilities designs that if there is a flaw in one or more of those, it's unlikely to completely affect the architecture. Might degrade the architecture a bit if that flaw or some kind of cyber vulnerability that's in one, it's unlikely to be in the others. So there's resiliency there by the fact there's multiple designs, multiple operation centers that are able to keep the mission going.
Thank you. And in a recent report, the Defense Business Board made the following recommendation. The Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment should obtain a memo from the SecDef exercising the provisions within 10 U.S. Code 4204B5 to give the Space SAE the ability to further delegate milestone decision authority of major defense acquisition programs, i.e. ACAT-1 programs, to program executive officers, end quote. What's your take on that recommendation? Has there been any progress along those lines? Do you feel like you have the authorities you need to do that?
I do, and frankly, I'm not just saying this because of my boss. I welcome the opportunity for major milestones to come back to the Pentagon and brief Honorable Cavelli. I'm a firm believer that we have to build the foundation very, very well. And I think in the past, sometimes we've rushed the foundation. We haven't let the concrete cure. We haven't had the right inspector come in and make sure the foundation is right. And we've started to build houses on top of that foundation to have that house crumble later because we didn't get it right. So I love the fact that we have to come and face the scrutiny and the experience that comes with that, all those involved in making sure we get that foundation right. But the question isn't really, do we have to come to the SAE for the milestone decision? Really, the question needs to be, well, what happens after that? And I can tell you that, and I greatly appreciate it, that Honorable Cavelli gives me all the authority I need after that foundation is built right. He agrees the foundation built right, is go build that house on top of that and not have to come back numerous times to the Pentagon to get permission to build the frame in this room this way or the plumbing in this way in the room, right? So I think that's the magic of the current process, that philosophy that the SAE has, is make sure you have that foundation built right, the acquisition strategy, the tech baseline, requirements, all that kind of stuff. And then once that's built right, and let people go and execute at the lowest level possible. So I think we have it right.
That's great. Thank you very much. We have time for one more question. We have about 3-4 minutes left. Could you give us a quick rundown of what you see as some of the most interesting opportunities, acquisition opportunities in the pipeline within the space sensing mission area?
Well, I'll just do one per, right? So you mentioned international earlier. I am really looking forward to exploring in the missile warning, missile tracking area, how we can better incorporate international. For lots of reasons, policy, whatnot, we haven't done that a lot, really deep in the mission area historically. I mean, obviously, there's been some, but I think there's opportunity there to further integrate and collaborate with international partners. In these space-based monitoring, it's what can commercial do? And we're all seeing the commercial space industry just blossom, and there is some of that that's happening in the weather area as well. It's really partnering with the industry. What can they do today? If we have a strong demand signal in the future, what could they do to offer capabilities for our fighter? And last, tactical surveillance, reconnaissance, and tracking. Just where can we go with that data analytics of commercially available and publicly available information? What is that warfighting utility? How do we continue to partner with IC to be able to provide that capability to the warfighter? So those are the 3 things I'm most excited about in the portfolio.
Thank you very much. I'm going to violate my comment before about the last question. One quick question on tech SRT. In general, what are you seeing in terms of the demand signal from the combatant commanders in that regard? What are they most interested in along these lines? Because obviously the program is at least in part intended to help meet some of their near-term needs.
Well, I've never met a command that doesn't want more.
But wasn't afraid to ask. Yeah.
More of whatever, right? And so, not surprising, the demand signal is very strong, and I don't expect that to change on any capability that we can provide them.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much. Just wanted to say thank you so much for your time. Again, please thank your team. The incredibly important work you guys are doing. You obviously are on top of your game, sir, and we greatly appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you today. Just want to thank our audience as well. Thank you for the good questions that came in from our audience. We deeply appreciate it. And so for the Moorman Center for Space Studies at the National Security Space Association, thank you again, sir. Keep up the fine work. And to all who are viewing this, thank you for your time today. Everyone have a great day, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you. Take care, sir.
Thank you.